The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 30. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer. Shall I have it? Merchant of Venice. The silence continued unbroken by human sounds for many anxious minutes. Then the waving multitude opened and shut again, and Uncas stood in the living circle. All those eyes which had been curiously studying the lineaments of the sage, as the source of their own intelligence, turned on the instant and were now bent in secret admiration on the erect, agile, and faultless person of the captive. But neither the presence in which he found himself nor the exclusive attention that he attracted in any manner disturbed the self-possession of the young Mohican. He cast a deliberate and observing look on every side of him, meeting the settled expression of hostility that lowered in the visages of the chiefs with the same calmness as the curious gaze of the attentive children. But when, last in his haughty scrutiny, the person of Tamenund came under his glance, his eye became fixed, as though all other objects were already forgotten. Then, advancing with a slow and noiseless step up the area, he placed himself immediately before the footstool of the sage. Here he stood unnoted, though keenly observant himself, until one of the chiefs apprised the latter of his presence. "With what tongue does the prisoner speak to the Manitou?" demanded the patriarch, without unclosing his eyes. "Like his father's," Uncas replied, "with the tongue of a Delaware." At this sudden and unexpected enunciation, a low, fierce yell ran through the multitude that might not inaptly be compared to the growl of a lion, and his caller is first awakened, a fearful omen of the weight of his future anger. The effect was equally strong on the sage, though differently exhibited. He passed a hand before his eyes as if to exclude the least evidence of so shameful a spectacle, while he repeated in his low guttural tones the word he had just heard. "A Delaware? I have lived to see the tribes of the Lenape driven from their council fires and scattered, like broken herds of deer, among the hills of the Iroquois. I have seen the hatchets of a strong people sweep woods from the valley that the winds of heaven have spared, the beasts that run on the mountains, and the birds that fly above the trees have I seen living in the wigwams of men, but I have never before have I found a Delaware so base as to creep like a poisonous serpent into the camps of his nation." "The singing birds have opened their bills," returned Uncas, in the softest notes of his own musical voice, "and Tamenund has heard their song." The sage started and bent his head aside as if to catch the fleeting sounds of some passing melody. "Does Tamenund dream?" he exclaimed. "What voice is at his ear? Have the winters gone backward? Will summer come again to the children of the Lenape?" A solemn and respectful silence succeeded this incoherent burst from the lips of the Delaware prophet. His people readily constructed his unintelligible language into one of those mysterious conferences he was believed to hold so frequently with a superior intelligence, and they awaited the issue of the revelation in awe. After a patient pause, however, one of the aged men, perceiving that the sage had lost the recollection of the subject before them, ventured to remind him again of the presence of the prisoner. "The false Delaware trembles lest he should hear the words of Tamenund," he said. "'Tis a hound that howls when the Yengeese show him a trail." "And ye," returned Uncas, looking sternly around him, "are dogs that whine when the Frenchman cast ye the offals of his deer." 20 knives gleamed in the air, and as many warriors sprang to their feet at this biting and perhaps merited retort. But a motion from one of the chiefs suppressed the outbreaking of their tempers and restored the appearance of quiet. The task might probably have been more difficult had not a movement made by Tamenund indicated that he was about to speak.
"Delaware," resumed the sage, "little art thou worthy of thy name. My people have not seen a bright sun in many winters, and the warrior who deserts his tribe when hid in clouds is doubly a traitor. The law of the Manitau is just. It is so. While the rivers run and the mountains stand, while the blossoms come and go on the trees, it must be so. He is thine, my children. Deal justly by him."
Not a limb was moved, nor was a breath drawn louder and longer than common until the closing syllable of this final decree had passed the lips of Tamenund. Then a cry of vengeance burst at once, as it might be from the united lips of a nation, a frightful augury of their ruthless intentions. In the midst of these prolonged and savage yells, a chief proclaimed in a high voice that the captive was condemned to endure the dreadful trial of torture by fire. The circle broke its order, and screams of delight mingled with the burst and tumult of preparation. Hayward struggled madly with his captors. The anxious eye of Hawkeye began to look around him with an expression of peculiar earnestness, and Cora again threw herself at the feet of the patriarch, once more a suppliant for mercy. Throughout the whole of these trying moments, Uncas had alone preserved his serenity. He looked on the preparations with a steady eye, and when the tormentors came to seize him, he met them with a firm and upright attitude. One among them, if possible more fierce and savage than his fellows, seized the hunting shirt of the young warrior, and at a single effort tore it from his body. Then, with a yell of frantic pleasure, he leaped toward his unresisting victim and prepared to lead him to the stake. But, at that moment, when he appeared most a stranger to the feelings of humanity, the purpose of the savage was arrested as suddenly as if by a supernatural agency had interposed in the behalf of Uncas. The eyeballs of the Delaware seemed to start from their sockets, his mouth opened, and his whole form became frozen in an attitude of amazement. Raising his hand with a slow and regulated motion, he pointed with a finger to the bosom of the captive. His companions crowded about him in wonder, and every eye was like his own, fastened intently on the figure of a small tortoise, beautifully tattooed on the breast of the prisoner in a bright blue tint. For a single instant Uncas enjoyed his triumph, smiling calmly on the scene. Then, motioning the crowd away with a high and haughty sweep of his arm, he advanced in front of the nation with the air of a king, and spoke in a voice louder than the murmur of admiration that ran through the multitude.
"Men of the Lenni Lenape," he said, "my race upholds the earth. Your feeble tribe stands on my shell. What fire that a Delaware can light would burn the child of my fathers," he added, pointing proudly to the simple blazonry on his skin. "The blood that came from such a stock would smother your flames. My race is the grandfather of nations."
"Who art thou?" demanded Tamenund, rising at the startling tones he had heard, more than at any meaning conveyed by the language of the prisoner.
"Uncas, the son of Chingachgook,"
answered the captive modestly, turning from the nation and bending his head in reverence to the other's character and years.
"A son of the great Unamis." "The hour of Tamenund is nigh," exclaimed the sage. "The day is come, at last, to the night. I thank the Manitau that one is here to fill my place at the council fire. Uncas, the child of Uncas, is found. Let the eyes of a dying eagle glaze on the rising sun."
The youth stepped lightly but proudly on the platform, where he became visible to the whole agitated and wondering multitude. Tamenund held him long at the length of his arm and read every turn in the fine lineaments of his countenance with the untiring gaze of one who recalled days of happiness.
"Is Tamenund a boy?"
at length the bewildered prophet exclaimed.
"Have I dreamed of so many snows that my people were scattered like floating sands, of Yengeese, more than plenty than the leaves of the trees? The arrow of Tamenund would not frighten the fawn. His arm is withered like the branch of a dead oak. The snail would be swifter in the race, yet is Uncas before him as they went to battle against the pale faces. Uncas, the panther of his tribe, the eldest son of the Lenape, the wisest sagamore of the Mohicans. Tell me, ye Delawares, has Tamenund been a sleeper for 100 winters?"
The calm and deep silence which succeeded these words sufficiently announced the awful reverence with which his people received the communication of the patriarch. None dared to answer, though all listened in breathless expectation of what might follow. Uncas, however, looking in his face with the fondness and veneration of a favored child, presumed on his own high and acknowledged rank to reply.
"4 warriors of this race have lived and died," he said, "since the friend of Tamenund led his people into battle. The blood of the turtle has been in many chiefs, but all have gone back into the earth from whence they came, except Chingachgook and his son." "It is true,
returned the sage, a flash of recollection destroying all his pleasing fancies and restoring him at once to a consciousness of the true history of his nation.
"Our wise men have often said that 2 warriors of the unchanged race were in the hills of the Yengeese. Why have their seats at the council fires of the Delawares been so long empty?"
At these words the young man raised his head, which he had still kept bowed a little, in reverence, and lifting his voice so as to be heard by the multitude, as if to explain at once and forever the policy of his family, he said aloud,
"Once we slept where we could hear the Salt Lake speak in its anger. Then we were rulers and sagamores over the land. But when a paleface was seen on every book, we followed the deer back to the river of our nation. The Delawares were gone. Few warriors of them all stayed to drink of the stream they loved. Then said my fathers, 'Here we will hunt. The waters of the river go into the Salt Lake. If we go toward the setting sun, we shall find streams that run into the great lakes of sweet water. There would a Mohican die, like fishes of the sea in the clear springs. When the Manitou is ready, we shall say, Come, we will follow the river to the sea and take our own again.' Such, Delawares, is the belief of the children of the turtle. Our eyes are on the rising and not toward the setting sun. We know whence he comes, but we know not whither he goes. It is enough."
The men of the Lenape listened to his words with all the respect that superstition could lend, finding a secret charm even in the figurative language with which the young sagamore imparted his ideas. Uncas himself watched the effect of his brief explanation with intelligent eyes and gradually dropped the air of authority he had assumed as he perceived that his auditors were content. Then, permitting his looks to wander over the silent throng that crowded around the elevated seat of Tamenund, he perceived Hawkeye in his bonds. Stepping eagerly from his strand, he made way for himself to the side of his friend, and cutting his thongs with a quick and angry stroke of his own knife, he motioned to the crowd to divide. The Indians silently obeyed, and once more they stood ranged in their circle, as before his appearance among them. Uncas took the scout by the hand and led him to the feet of the patriarch.
"Father,"
he said.
Look at this pale face. A just man, and the friend of the Delawares.
Is he a son of Minquon?
Not so. A warrior known to the Yengeese and feared by the Maquas.
What name has he gained by his deeds?
We call him Hawkeye, Uncas replied, using the Delaware phrase. For his sight never fails. The Mingos know him better by the death he gives their warriors. With him, he is the long rifle.
Le long carabine,
exclaimed Tamenund, opening his eyes and regarding the scout sternly.
My son has not done well to call him friend.
I call him so who proves himself such, returned the young chief, with great calmness, but with a steady mien. If Uncas is welcome among the Delawares, then is Hawkeye with his friends.
The paleface has slain my young men. His name is great for the blows he has struck the Lenape.
If a Mingo has whispered that much in the ear of the Delaware, he has only shown that he is a singing bird. Oh. If a Mingo has whispered that much in the ear of the Delaware, he has only shown that he is a singing bird, said the scout, who now believed that it was time to vindicate himself from such offensive charges, and who spoke as the man he addressed, modifying his Indian figures, however, with his own peculiar notions. That I have slain the Maquas I am not the man to deny, even at their own council fires, but that, knowingly, my hand has never harmed a Delaware, is opposed to the reason of my gifts, which is friendly to them, and all that belongs to their nation. A low exclamation of applause passed among the warriors, who exchanged looks with each other like men that first began to perceive their error.
Where is the Huron? Demanded Tamenund. Has he stopped my ears?
Magua, whose feelings during that scene in which Uncas had triumphed may be much better imagined than described, answered to the call by stepping boldly in front of the patriarch.
The just Tamenund, he said, will not keep what a Huron has lent.
Tell me, son of my brother, returned the sage, avoiding the dark countenance of Le Subtil, and turning gladly to the more ingenuous features of Uncas. Has the stranger a conqueror's right over you? He has none. The panthers may get into the snares set by a woman, but he is strong and knows how to leap through them. Le long carabine?
Laughs at the Mingos. Go, Huron.
Ask your squaws the color of a bear. The strange and white maiden that come into my camp together.
Should journey on an open path.
And the woman that Huron left with my warriors?
Uncas made no reply.
And the woman that the Mingo has brought into my camp,
repeated Tamenund gravely.
She is mine,
cried Magua, shaking his hand in triumph at Uncas.
Mohican, you know that she is mine.
My son is silent,
said Tamenund, endeavoring to read the expression of the face that the youth turned from him in sorrow.
It is so,
was the low answer. A short and impressive pause succeeded, during which it was very apparent with what reluctance the multitude admitted the justice of the Mingo's claim. At length the sage, on whom alone the decision depended, said in a firm voice,
Huron, depart.
As he came, just Tamenund, demanded the wily Magua, or with hands filled with the faith of the Delawares. The wigwam of Le Renard Subtil is empty. Make him strong with his own.
The aged man mused for himself for a time, and then, bending his head toward one of his venerable companions, he asked,
Are my ears open?
It is true.
Is this Mingo a chief?
The first in his nation. Girl, what wouldst thou? A great warrior takes thee to wife. Go, thy race will not end.
Better 1,000 times it should, exclaimed the horror-struck Cora, than meet with such a degradation.
Huron, her mind is in the tents of her fathers. An unwilling maiden makes an unhappy wigwam.
She speaks with the tongue of her people, returned Magua, regarding his victim with a look of bitter irony.
She is the race of traders, and will bargain for a bright look. Let Terminon speak the word.
Take you the wampum, and our love.
Nothing hence but what Magua brought hither.
Then depart with Denaun. The great Maritau forbids that a Delaware should be unjust.
Magua advanced and seized his captive strongly by the arm. The Delawares fell back in silence, and Cora, as if conscious that remonstrance would be useless, prepared to submit to her fate without resistance.
"Hold! Hold!"
cried Duncan, springing forward.
"Huron, have mercy! Her ransom shall make thee richer than any of thy people were ever yet known to be."
Magua is a red skin. He wants not the beads of the pale faces.
Gold, silver, power, lead, all that a warrior needs shall be in thy wigwam, all that becomes the greatest chief.
Le Subtil is very strong, cried Magua,
violently shaking the hand which grasped the unresisting arm of Cora.
He has his revenge.
Mighty ruler of Providence, exclaimed
Hayward, clasping his hands together in agony.
Can this be suffered? To you, just Terminon, I appeal for mercy. The words of the Delaware are said, returned the sage,
closing his eyes and dropping back into his seat, alike wearied with his mental and his bodily exertion.
Men speak not twice.
That a chief should not misspend his time in unsaying what has once been spoken is wise and reasonable, said Hawkeye, motioning to Duncan to be silent. But it is also prudent in every warrior to consider well before he strikes his tomahawk into the head of a prisoner. Huron, I love you not, nor can I say that any Mingo has ever received much favor at my hands. It is fair to conclude that if this war does not end soon, many more of your warriors will meet me in the woods. Put it to your judgment, then, whether you would prefer taking such a prisoner as that into your encampment, or one like myself, who am a man that it would greatly rejoice your nation to see with naked hands. Will Long Rifle give his life for the woman? Demanded Magua, hesitatingly, for he had already made a notion towards quitting the place with his victim. No, I have not said so much as that, returned Hawkeye, drawing back with suitable discretion when he noted the eagerness with which Magua listened to his proposal. It would be an unequal exchange to give a warrior, in the prime of his age and usefulness, for the best woman on the frontiers. I might consent to go into winter quarters, now, at least 6 weeks before the leaves will turn, on condition you will release the maiden. Magua shook his head and made an impatient sign for the crowd to open. Well then, added the scout, with the musing air of a man who had not half made up his mind, I will throw Killdeer into the bargain. Take the word of an experienced hunter. The peace has not its equal atween the provinces. Magua still disdained to reply, continuing his efforts to disperse the crowd. Perhaps, added the scout, losing his dissembled coolness exactly in proportion as the others manifested an indifference to the exchange. If I should condition to teach your young man the real virtue of the weapon, it would smooth the little differences in our judgments. Le Renard fiercely ordered the Delawares, who still lingered in an impenetrable belt around him, in hopes that he would listen to the amicable proposal to open his path, threatening, by the glance of the eye, another appeal to the infallible justice of their prophet. What he ordered must sooner or later arrive, continued Hawkeye, turning with the sad and humbled look to Uncas.
The varlet knows his advantage and will keep it. God bless you, boy, you have found friends among your natural kin, and I hope that you will prove as true as some you have met who had no Indian cross. As for me, sooner or later I must die. It is, therefore, fortunate there are but few to make any death howl. After all, it is likely the imps who have managed to master my scalp, so a day or two will make no great difference in the everlasting reckoning of time. God bless you, added the rugged woodsman, bending his head aside and then instantly changing its direction again with a wistful look toward the youth. I loved both you and your father, Uncas, though our skins are not altogether of a color, and our gifts are somewhat different. Tell the Sagamore I never lost sight of him in my greatest trouble. And, as for you, think of me sometimes when on a lucky trail, and depend on it, boy, whether there be one heaven or two, there is a path in the other world by which honest men may come together again. You'll find the rifle in the place we hid it. Take it, and keep it for my sake, and hark ye, lad, as your natural gifts don't deny you the use of vengeance, use it a little freely on the Mingoes. May unburden griefs at my loss and ease your mind. Huron, I accept your offer. Release the woman, I am your prisoner. A suppressed, but still distinct murmur of approbation ran through the crowd at this generous proposition, even the fiercest among the Delaware warriors manifesting pleasure at the thought, at the manliness of this intended sacrifice. Magua passed, and for an anxious moment it might be said he doubted. Then, casting his eyes on Cora, with an expression in which ferocity and admiration were strangely mingled, his purpose became fixed forever. He intimated his contempt of the offer with a backward motion of the head and said, in a steady and settled voice, Le Renard Subtil is a great chief. He has but one mind. Come, he added, laying his hand too familiarly on the shoulder of his captive to urge her onward. A Huron is no tattler. We will go. The maid drew back in a loftily womanly reserve, and her dark eye kindled, while the rich blood shot, like the passing brightness of the sun, into her very temples at the indignity. I am your prisoner, and at a fitting time shall be ready to follow, even to my death. But violence is unnecessary, she coldly said, and immediately turning to Hawkeye added, Generous hunter, for my soul I thank you. Your offer is vain, neither could it be accepted, but still you may serve me, even more than in your noble intention. Look at that drooping, humble child. Abandon her not until you leave her in the habitations of civilized men. I will not say, wringing the hard hand of the scout, that her father will reward you, for such as you are above the rewards of men, but he will thank you and bless you, and believe me, the blessing of a just and aged man has virtue in the sight of heaven. Would to God I could hear one word from his lips at this awful moment. Her voice became choked, and for an instant she was silent. Then, advancing a step nigher to Duncan, who was supporting her unconscious sister, she continued, in a more subdued tones, but in which feeling and the habits of her sex maintained a fearful struggle. I need to tell you to cherish the treasure you will possess. You love her, Hayward. That would conceal 1,000 faults, though she had them. She is kind, gentle, sweet, good, as mortal may be. There is not a blemish in mind or person at which the proudest of you all would sicken. She is fair. Oh, how surpassingly fair. Laying her own beautiful but less brilliant hand in melancholy affection on the alabaster forehead of Alice, and parting the golden hair which clustered about her brows. And yet her soul is pure as spotless as her skin. I could say much more, perhaps, than cooler reason would approve, but I will spare you and myself. Her voice became inaudible, and her face was bent over the form of her sister. After a long and burning kiss she arose, and with features on the hue of death, but without even a tear in her feverish eye, she turned away and added to the savage, with all their former elevation of manner, Now, sir, if it be your pleasure, I will follow. I go, cried Duncan, placing Alice in the arms of an Indian girl.
Go, Magua, go! Those Delawares have their laws which forbid them to detain you, but I have no such obligation. Go, malignant monster, why do you delay? It will be difficult to describe the expression with which Magua listened to this threat to follow. There was at first a fierce and manifest display of joy, and then it instantly subdued in a look of cunning coolness.
The words are open, he was content with saying. The open hand can come.
Hold! Cried Hawkeye, seizing Duncan by the arm and detaining him by violence. You know not the craft of the imp. He would lead you to an ambushment and your death.
Huron, interrupted Uncas, who, submissive to the stern customs of his own people, had been an attentive and grave listener to all that passed. Huron, the justice of the Delawares come from the Manitow. Look at the sun. He is now in the upper branches of the hemlock. Your path is short and open. When he is seen above the trees, there will be men on your tail.
I hear a crow, exclaimed Magua with a taunting laugh. Go, he added, shaking his hand at the crowd, which had slowly opened to admit his passage. Where are the petticoats of the Delawares? Let them send their arrows and their guns to the Wyandots. They shall have venison to eat and corn to hoe. Dogs, rabbits, thieves, I spit on you.
His parting jibes were listened to in a dead, boding silence, and with these biting words in his mouth, the triumphant Magua passed unmolested into the forest, followed by his passing captive and protected by the inviolable laws of Indian hospitality. Chapter 31. Kill the poise and the luggage. 'Tis expressly against the law of arms. 'Tis as errant a piece of knavery, mark you now, as can be offered in the whole world. King Henry V. So long as their enemy and his victim continued in sight, the multitude remained motionless as beings charmed to the place by some power that was friendly to the Huron. But the instant he disappeared, it became tossed and agitated by fierce and powerful passion. Uncas maintained his elevated stand, keeping his eyes on the form of Cora until the colors of her dress were blended with the foliage of the forest. When he descended, and, moving silently through the throng, he disappeared in that lodge from which he had so recently issued. A few of the graver and more attentive warriors, who caught the gleams of anger that shot from the eyes of the young chief in passing, followed him to the place he had selected for his meditations. After which, Tamenund and Alice were removed, and the women and children were ordered to disperse. During the momentous hour that succeeded, the encampment resembled a hive of troubled bees who only awaited the appearance and example of their leader to take some distant and momentous flight. A young warrior issued from the lodge of Uncas, and, moving deliberately, with a sort of grave march, toward a pine tree that grew in the crevices of the rocky terrace, he tore the bark from its body, and then turned whence he came without speaking. He was soon followed by another, who stripped the sapling of its branches, leaving it naked and blazed trunk. The third colored the post with stripes of a dark red paint, all which indications of a hostile design in the leaders of the nation were received by the men without in a gloomy and ominous silence. Finally, the Mohican himself reappeared, divested of all his attire except his girdle and leggings, and with one half of his fine features hid under a cloud of threatening black. Uncas moved with a slow and dignified tread toward the post, which he immediately commenced encircling with a measured step, not unlike an ancient dance, raising his voice at the same time in the wild and irregular chant of his war song. The notes were in the extremes of human sounds, being sometimes melancholy and exquisitely plaintive, even rivaling the melody of birds, and then, by
sudden and startling transitions, causing the auditors to tremble by their depth and energy. The words were few and often repeated, proceeding gradually from a sort of invocation or hymn to the deity to an intimation of the warrior's object, and terminating as they commenced with an acknowledgment of his own dependence on the Great Spirit. If it were possible to translate the comprehensive and melodious language in which he spoke, the ode might read something like the following: Manitau, 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 thou art great, thou art good, thou art wise. Manitau, Manitau, thou art just, in the heavens, in the clouds. Oh, I see many spots, many dark, many red. In the heavens, oh, I see many clouds. In the woods, in the air, oh, I hear the whoop, the long yell, and the cry. In the woods, oh, I hear the loud whoop. Manitau, 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 I am weak, thou art strong. I am slow, Manitau, Manitau, give me aid. At the end of what might be called each verse, he made a pause by raising a note louder and longer than common that was peculiarly suited to the sentiment just expressed. The first close was solemn and intended to convey the idea of veneration, the second descriptive, bordering on the alarming, and the third was the well-known and terrific war whoop, which burst from the lips of the young warrior like a combination of all the frightful sounds of battle. The last was like the first, humble and imploring. 3 times did he repeat this song, and as often did he encircle the post in his dance. At the close of the first turn, a grave and highly esteemed chief of the Lenape followed his example, singing words of his own, however, to music of a similar character. Warrior after warrior enlisted in the dance, until all of any renown and authority were numbered in its mazes. The spectacle now became wildly terrific, the fierce-looking and menacing visages of the chiefs receiving additional power from the appalling strains in which they mingled in their guttural tones. Just then Uncas struck his tomahawk deep into the post and raised his voice in a shout which might be termed his own battle-cry. The act announced that he had just assumed the chief authority in the intended expedition. It was a signal that awakened all the slumbering passions of the nation. 100 youths who had hitherto been restrained by the diffidence of their years rushed in a frantic body on the fancied emblem of their enemy and severed it asunder, splinter by splinter, until nothing remained of the trunk but its roots in the earth. During this moment of tumult, the most ruthless deeds of war were performed on the fragments of the tree with as much apparent ferocity as if they were the living victims of their cruelty. Some were scalped, some received the keen and trembling axe, and others suffered by thrust from the fatal knife. In short, the manifestations of zeal and fierce delight were so great and unequivocal that the expedition was declared to be a war of the nation. The instant Uncas had struck the blow, he moved out of the circle and cast his eyes up to the sun, which was just gaining the point when the truce with Magua was to end. The fact was soon announced by a significant gesture, accompanied by a corresponding cry, and the whole of the excited multitude abandoned their mimic war cry with shrill yells of pleasure to prepare for the more hazardous experiment of the reality. The whole face of the encampment was instantly changed. The warriors, who were already armed and painted, became as still as if they were incapable of any uncommon burst of emotion. On the other hand, the women broke out of the lodges with the songs of joy and those of lamentation so strangely mixed that it might have been difficult to have said which passion preponderated. None, however, was idle. Some bore their choicest articles, others their young, and some their aged and infirm, into the forest, which spread itself like a verdant carpet of bright green against the side of the mountain. Thither Tamenund also retired, with calm composure, after a short and touching interview with Uncas, from whom the sage separated with the reluctance that a parent would quit a long-lost and just-recovered child. In the meantime, Duncan saw Alice to a place of safety and then sought the scout, with a countenance that denoted how eagerly he also panted for the approaching contest. But Hawkeye was too much accustomed to the war song and the enlistments of the natives to betray any interest in the passing scene. He merely cast an occasional look at the number and quality of the warriors who, from time to time, signified their readiness to accompany Uncas to the field. In this particular he was soon satisfied, for, as had been already seen, the power of the young chief quickly embraced every fighting man in the nation. After this material point was so satisfactorily decided, he dispatched an Indian boy in the quest of Killdeer and the rifle of Uncas to the place where they had deposited their weapons on approaching the camp of the Delawares, a measure of double policy, inasmuch as it protected the arms from their own fate, if detained as prisoners, and gave them the advantage of appearing among the strangers rather as sufferers than as men provided with the mean of defense and subsistence. In selecting another to perform the office of reclaiming the highly prized rifle, the scout had lost sight of none of his habitual caution. He knew that Magua had not come unattended, and he also knew that Huron spies watched the movements of their new enemies along the whole boundary of the woods. It would, therefore, have been fatal to himself to have attempted the experiment. A warrior would have fared no better, but the danger of a boy would not be likely to commence until after his object was discovered. When Hayward joined him, the scout was coolly awaiting the result of this experiment. The boy, who had been well instructed and was sufficiently crafty, proceeded, with a bosom that was swelling with the pride of such a confidence, and all the hopes of young ambition, carelessly across the clearing to the wood, which he entered at a point at some little distance from the place where the guns were secreted. The instant, however, he was concealed by the foliage of the bushes, his dusky form was seen to be gliding, like that of a serpent, toward the desired treasure. He was successful, and in another moment he appeared flying across the narrow opening that skirted the base of the terrace on which the village stood, with the velocity of an arrow and bearing a prize in each hand. He had actually gained the crags and was leaping up their sides with incredible activity when a shot from the woods showed how accurate had been the judgment of the scout. The boy answered it with a feeble but contemptuous shout, and immediately a second bolt was sent after him from another part of the cover. At the next instant he appeared on the level above, elevating his guns in triumph, while he moved with the air of a conqueror toward the renowned hunter who had honored him by so glorious a commission. Notwithstanding the lively interest Hawkeye had taken in the fate of his messenger, he received Killdeer with the satisfaction that momentarily drove all other recollections from his mind. After examining the piece with an intelligent eye, and opening and shutting the pan some 10 or 15 times, and trying sundry other equally important experiments in the lock, he turned towards the boy and demanded with great manifestations of kindness if he was hurt. The urchin looked proudly up in his face, but made no reply.
"Ah, I see, lad. The knaves have barked your arm," added the scout, taking up the limb of the patient sufferer, across which a deep flesh wound had been made by one of the bullets. "But a little bruised alder will act like a charm. In the meantime I will wrap it in a badge of wampum. You have commenced the business of a warrior early, my brave boy, and are likely to bear plenty of honorable scars to your grave. I know many young men that have taken scalps who cannot show such a mark as this. Go!" Having bound up the arm, "you will be a chief." The lad departed, prouder of his flowing blood than the vainest courtier could be of a blushing ribbon, and stalked amongst the fellows of his age, an object of general admiration and envy. But in a moment of so many serious and important duties, this single act of juvenile fortitude did not attract the general notice and commendation it would have received under milder auspices. It had, however, served to apprise the Delawares of the position and the intentions of their enemies. Accordingly, a party of adventurers better suited to the task than the weak, though spirited boy, was ordered to dislodge the skulkers. The duty was soon performed, for most of the Hurons were tired of themselves when they found they had been discovered.
The Delawares followed to a sufficient distance from their own encampment and then halted for orders, apprehensive of being led into an ambush. As both parties secreted themselves, the woods were again as still and quiet as a mild summer morning and deep solitude could render them. The calm but still patient Uncas now collected his chiefs and divided his power. He presented Hawkeye as a warrior, often tried, and always found deserving of confidence. When he found his friend met with a favorable reception, he bestowed on him a command of 20 men, like himself, active, skillful, and resolute. He gave the Delawares to understand the rank of Hayward among the troops of the Yengeese, and then tendered to him a trust of equal authority. But Duncan declined the charge, professing his readiness to serve as a volunteer by the side of the scout. After this disposition, the young Mohican appointed various native chiefs to fill the different situations of responsibility, and, by the time pressing, he gave forth the word to march. He was cheerfully but silently obeyed by more than 200 men. The entrance into the forest was perfectly unmolested, nor did they encounter any living objects that could either give the alarm or furnish the intelligence they needed until they came upon the lairs of their own scouts. Here a halt was ordered, and the chiefs were assembled to hold a whispering council. At this meeting, divers plans of operation were suggested, though none of a character to meet the wishes of their ardent leader. Had Uncas followed the promptings of his own inclinations, he would have led his followers to the charge without a moment's delay, and put the conflict to the hazard of an instant issue. But such a course would have been in opposition to all the received practices and opinions of his countrymen. He was therefore fain to adopt a caution that, in the present temper of his mind, he execrated, and to listen to advice at which his fiery spirit chafed, under the vivid recollection of Cora's danger and Magua's insolence. After an unsatisfactory conference of many minutes, a solitary individual was seen advancing from the side of the enemy, with such apparent haste as to induce the belief that he might be a messenger charged with pacific overtures. When within 100 yards, however, of the cover behind the Delaware council had assembled, the stranger hesitated, appeared uncertain what course to take, and finally halted. All eyes were turned now on Uncas, as if seeking directions how to proceed.
"Hawkeye,"
said the young chief, in a low voice again,
"he must never speak to the Hurons again." "His time has come," said the laconic scout, thrusting the long barrel of his rifle through the leaves and taking his deliberate and fatal aim. But instead of pulling the trigger, he lowered the muzzle again and indulged himself in a fit of his peculiar mirth. "I took the imp for a Mingo, as I'm a miserable sinner," he said. "But when my eye ranged along his ribs for a place to get the bullet in, what'd you think it, Uncas? I saw the musicianer's blower, and so, after all, it is the man they call Gamut, whose death can profit no one, and whose life, if this tongue could do anything but sing, may be made serviceable to our own ends. Its sounds have not lost their virtue. I'll soon have a discourse with this honest fellow, and that in a voice he'll find more agreeable than the speech of Killdeer." So saying, Hawkeye laid aside his rifle, and crawling through the bushes until within speaking of David, he attempted to recall the musical effort which had conducted himself with so much safety and eclat through the Huron encampment. The exquisite organs of Gamut could not readily be deceived, and to say the truth, it would have been difficult for any other than Hawkeye to produce a similar noise, and consequently, having once before heard the sounds, he now knew whence they proceeded. The poor fellow appeared relieved from a state of great embarrassment, and pursuing the direction of the voice, a task that to him was not much less arduous than it would have been to have gone up in the face of a battery, he soon discovered the hidden songster. "I wonder what the Hurons will think of that," said the scout, laughing as he took his companion by the arm and urged him toward the rear. "If the knaves lie within earshot, they will say there are 2 non-composers instead of 1. But here we are safe," he added, pointing to Uncas and his associates. "Now give us the history of the Mingo interventions in natural English, and without any ups or downs of voice."
David gazed about him at the fierce and wild-looking chiefs in mute wonder, but assured by the presence of faces that he knew, he soon rallied his faculties so far as to make an intelligent reply.
The heathen are broad in goodly numbers, said David, and I fear with evil intent. There has been much howling and ungodly revelry, together with such sounds as it is profanity to utter, in their habitations within the past hour, so much so, in truth, that I have fled to the Delawares in search of peace.
Your ears might not have profited by much exchange, had you been quicker of foot, returned the scout a little dryly. But let that be as it may. Where are the Hurons?
They lie hid in the forest between this spot and their village in such force that prudence would teach you instantly to return.
Uncas cast a glance along the range of trees which concealed his own band, and mentioned the name of Magua.
Is among them. He brought in the maiden that had sojourned with the Delawares, and, leaving her in the cave, has put himself like a raging wolf at the head of his savages. I know not what has troubled his spirit so greatly.
He has left her, you say, in the cave? Interrupted Hayward. 'Tis well that we know its situation. May not something be done for her instant relief? Uncas looked earnestly at the scout before he asked, What says Hawkeye? Give me 20 rifles, and I will turn to the right along the stream, and passing by the huts of the beaver, will join the Sagamore and the Colonel. You shall then hear the whoop from that quarter. With this wind one may easily send it a mile. Then, Uncas, do you drive in the front. When they come within range of our pieces, we will give them a blow that, I pledge the good name of an old frontiersman, shall make their line bend like ashen bow. After which we will carry the village, and take the woman from the cave, when the affair may be finished with the tribe, according to a white man's battle, by a blow and a victory, or, in the Indian fashion, with dodge and cover. There may be no great learning, Major, in this plan, but with courage and patience it can all be done. I like that very much, cried Duncan, who saw that the release of Cora was the primary object in the mind of the scout. I like it much. Let it be instantly attempted. After a short conference, the plan was matured and rendered more intelligible to the several parties. The different signals were appointed, and the chiefs separated, each to his allotted station. Chapter 32. But plagues shall spread, and the funeral fires increase, till the great king, without a ransom paid, to her own Crissa send the black-eyed maid. Pope. During the time Uncas was making this disposition of his forces, the woods were as still, and, with the exception of those who had met in council, apparently as much untenanted as when they came fresh from the hands of the almighty Creator. The eye could range in every direction through the long and shadowed vistas of the trees, but nowhere was any object to be seen that did not properly belong to the peaceful and slumbering scenery. Here and there a bird was heard fluttering among the branches of the beeches, and occasionally a squirrel dropped a nut, drawing the startling looks of the party for a moment to the place. But the instant the casual interruption ceased, the passing air was heard murmuring above their heads along that verdant and undulating surface of the forest which spread itself unbroken, unless by stream or lake, over such a vast region of country. Across the tract of wilderness which lay between the Delawares and the village of their enemies, it seemed as if the foot of man had never trodden, so breathing and deep was the silence in which it lay. But Hawkeye, whose duty led him foremost into the adventure, knew the character of those with whom he was about to contend too well to trust the treacherous quiet. When he saw his little band collected, the scout threw Killdeer into the hollow of his arm, and making a silent signal that he would be followed, he led them many rods toward the rear, into the rod of a little brook which they had crossed in advancing. Here he halted, and after waiting for the whole of his grave and attentive warriors to close about him, he spoke in Delaware, demanding,
Do any of my young men know whither this run will lead us?"
A Delaware stretched forth a hand, with 2 fingers separated, indicating the manner in which they were joined at the root. He answered,
"Before the sun could go at his own length, the little water will be in the big."
Then he added, pointing in the direction of the place he mentioned,
"The 2 make enough for the beavers."
"I thought as much,"
returned the scout, glancing his eye upward at the opening in the tree-tops.
"From the course it takes and the bearing of the mountains. Men, we will keep within the cover of its banks till we scent the Hurons."
His companions gave the usual brief exclamation of assent, but perceiving that their leader was about to lead the way in person, 1 or 2 made signs that all was not as it should be. Hawkeye, who comprehended their meaning glances, turned and perceived that his party had been followed thus far by the singing master.
"Do you know, friend,"
asked the scout, gravely, and perhaps with a little of the pride of conscience deserving in his manner,
"that this is a band of rangers chosen for the most desperate service, and put under the command of one who, though another might say it with a better face, will not be apt to leave them idle? It may not be 5, it cannot be 30 minutes before we tread on the body of a Huron, living or dead."
"Though not admonished for your intention of words," returned David, whose face was a little flushed, and whose ordinarily quiet and unmeaning eyes glimmered with an expression of unusual fire. "Your men have reminded me of the children of Jacob going out to battle against the Shechemites for wickedly aspiring to wedlock with a woman of a race that was favored by the Lord. Now I have journeyed far, and sojourned much in good and evil with the maiden ye seek, and though not a man of war, with my loins girded and my sword sharpened, yet would I gladly strike a blow in her behalf." The scout hesitated, as if weighing the chances of such a strange enlistment in his mind before he answered,
"You know not the use of any weapon. You carry no rifle, and believe me, what the Mingos take, they will freely give again."
"Though not a vaunting and bloodily disposed Goliath," returned David, drawing a sling from beneath his partly covered and uncouth attire, "I have not forgotten the example of the Jewish boy. With this ancient instrument of war I practiced much in my youth, and peradventure this skill has not entirely departed from me."
"Aye,"
said Hawkeye, considering the deerskin thong and apron with a cold and discouraging eye.
"this thing might do its work among arrows or even knives. But these Mengui have been furnished by the Frenchers with a good-grooved barrel a man. However, it seems to be your gift to go unharmed amid fire, and as you have hitherto been favored, Major, you have left your rifle at a cock. A single shot before the time would be just 20 scalps lost to no purpose. Singer, you can follow. You may find use for you in the shoutings."
"I thank you, friend," returned David, supplying himself, like his royal namesake, from among the pebbles of the brook. "Though not given to the desire to kill, had you sent me away, my spirit would have been troubled."
"Remember,"
added the scout, tapping his own head significantly on that spot where Gamut was yet sore,
"we come to fight, and not to musicate. Until the general whoop is given, nothing speaks but the rifle."
David nodded, as much to signify his acquiescence with the terms, and then Hawkeye, casting another observant glance over his followers, made the signal to proceed. Their route lay for the distance of a mile along the bed of the watercourse. Though protected from any great danger of observation by the precipitous banks and the thick shrubbery which skirted the stream, no precaution known to an Indian attack was neglected. A warrior rather crawled than walked on each flank so as to catch occasional glimpses into the forest, and every few minutes the band came to a halt and listened for hostile sounds, with an acuteness of organs that would be scarcely conceivable to a man in a less natural state. Their march was, however, unmolested, and they reached the point where the lesser stream was lost in the greater without the smallest evidence that their progress had been noted. Here the scout again halted to consult the signs of the forest.
"We are likely to have a good good day for a fight," he said in English, addressing Hayward, and glancing his eyes upwards at the clouds, which began to move in broad sheets across the firmament. "A bright sun and a glittering barrel are no friends to true sight. Everything is favorable. They have the wind, which will bring down their noise and their smoke too. No little matter in itself, whereas with us it will be first a shot, and then a clear view. But here is an end to our cover. The beavers have had the range of this stream for hundreds of years, and what atween their food and their dams there is, as you see, many a girdled stub, but few living trees." Hawkeye had, in truth, in these few words, given no bad description of the prospect that now lay in their front. The brook was irregular in its width, sometimes shooting through narrow little fissures in the rocks, and at others spreading among over acres of bottomland, forming little areas that might be termed ponds. Everywhere along its band were the moldering relics of dead trees in all stages of decay, from those that groaned on their tottering trunks to such as had recently been robbed of those rugged coats that so mysteriously contained their principle of life. A few long, low, and moss-covered piles were scattered among them, like the memorials of a former and long-departed generation. All these minute particulars were noted by the scout with a gravity and interest that they probably had never before attracted. He knew that the Huron encampment lay a short half-mile up the brook, and with the characteristic anxiety of one who dreaded a hidden danger, he was greatly troubled at not finding the smallest trace of the presence of his enemy. Once or twice he felt induced to give the order for a rush and to attempt the village by surprise, but his experience quickly admonished him of the danger of so useless an experiment. Then he listened intently and with painful uncertainty for the sounds of hostility in the quarter where Uncas was left. But nothing was audible except the sighing of the wind that began to sweep over the bosom of the forest in gusts which threatened a tempest. At length, yielding rather to his unusual impatience than taking counsel from his knowledge, he determined to bring matters to an issue by unmasking his force and proceeding cautiously but steadily up the stream. The scout had stood while making his observations, sheltered by a break, and his companions still lay in the bed of the ravine through which the smaller stream debouched. But on hearing his low, though intelligible signal, the whole party stole up like so many dark specters, and silently arranged themselves around him. Pointing in the direction he wished to proceed, Hawkeye advanced, the band breaking off in single files, and following so accurately in his footsteps as to leave it, if we except Hayward and David, the trail of but a single man. The party was, however, scarcely uncovered before a volley from a dozen rifles was heard in their rear, and a Delaware, leaping high into the air like a wounded deer, fell at his whole length, dead.
"Ah, I feared some deviltry like this," exclaimed the scout, in English, adding with the quickness of thought in his adopted tongue, "To cover, men, and charge!" The band dispersed at the word, and before Hayward had well recovered from his surprise, he found himself standing alone with David. Lucky the Hurons had already fallen back, and he was safe from their fire. But this state of things was evidently to be of short continuance, for the scout set the example of pressing on their retreat by discharging his rifle and darting from tree to tree as if his enemy slowly yielded ground. It would seem that the assault had been made by a very small party of the Hurons, which, however, continued to increase in numbers as it retired on its friends, until the return fire was very neatly, if not quite, equal to that maintained by the advancing Delawares. Hayward threw himself among the combatants, and imitating the necessary caution of his companions, he made quick discharges with his own rifle. The contest now grew warm and stationary. Few were injured, as both parties kept their bodies as much protected as possible by the trees, never, indeed, exposing any part of their persons except in the act of taking aim. But the chances were gradually growing unfavorably to Hawkeye and his band. The quick-sighted scout perceived the danger without knowing how to remedy it. He saw it was more dangerous to retreat than to maintain his ground, while he found his enemy throwing out men on his flank, which rendered the task of keeping themselves covered so very difficult to the Delawares as nearly to silence their fire.
At this embarrassing moment, when they began to think the whole of the hostile tribe was gradually circling them, they heard the yell of the combatants and the rattling of arms echoing under the arches of the wood at the place where Uncas was posted, a bottom which, in a manner, lay beneath the ground on which Hawkeye and his party were contending. The effects of this attack were instantaneous, and to the scout and his friends greatly relieving. It would seem that, while his own surprise had been anticipated, and had consequently failed, the enemy, in their turn, having been deceived in its object and its numbers, had left too small a force to resist the impetuous onset of the young Mohican. This fact was doubly apparent by the rapid manner in which the battle in the forest rolled upward toward the village, and by an instant falling off in the number of their assailants, who rushed to assist in maintaining the front, and it has now proved to be the principal point of defense. Animating his followers by his voice and his own example, Hawkeye then gave the word to bear down upon their foes. The charge, in that rude species of warfare, consisted merely in pushing from cover to cover, nigher to the enemy, and in this maneuver he was instantly and successfully obeyed. The Hurons were compelled to withdraw, and the scene of the contest rapidly changed from the more open ground on which it had commenced to a spot where the assailed found a thicket to rest upon. Here the struggle was protracted, arduous, and seemingly of doubtful issue. The Delawares, though none of them fell, beginning to bleed freely in consequence of the disadvantage at which they were held. In this crisis, Hawkeye found means to get behind the same tree as that which served for a cover to Hayward, most of his own combatants being within a call a little on his right, where they maintained rapid, though fruitless, discharges of their sheltered enemies.
"You are a young man, Major," said the scout, dropping the butt of killdeer to the earth and leaning on the barrel, little fatigued with his previous industry. "And it may be your gift to lead armies some future day again in these imps, these Mingos. You may see the philosophy of an Indian fight. It consists mainly in a ready hand, a quick eye, and a good cover. Now, if you had a company of the Royal Americans here, in what manner would you seek them to work in this business?"
"The bayonet would make a road."
"Aye, there is right reason in what you say. But a man must ask himself, in this wilderness, how many lives can he spare?" "No, horse," continued the scout, shaking his head like one who mused. "Horse, I am ashamed to say, must sooner or later decide these scrimmages. The brutes are better than men, and to horse we must come at last. Put a shot and hoof on the moccasin of a redskin, and if his rifle once be emptied, he will never stop to load it again."
Note: the American forest admits of the passage of horses, there being little underbrush and few tangled brakes. The plan of Hawkeye is the one which always proved the most successful in the battles between the whites and the Indians. Wayne, in his celebrated campaign on the Miami, received the fire of his enemies in line, and then, causing the dragoons to wheel around his flanks, the Indians were driven from the covers before they had time to load. One of the most conspicuous of the chiefs who fought in the Battle of Miami assured the writer that the red men could not fight the warriors with long knives and leather stockings, meaning the dragoons with their sabers and boots. "This is a subject that might better be discussed at another time," returned Hayward. "Shall we charge?"
"I see no contradiction to the gifts of any man in passing his breathing spells in useful reflections," the scout replied. "As to rush, I little relish such a measure, for a scalp or two must be thrown away in the attempt, and yet," he added, bending his head aside to catch the sounds of the distant combat, "if we are to be of use to Uncas, these knaves of our front must be got rid of."
Then, turning with a prompt and decided air, he called aloud to his Indians in their own language. His words were answered by a shout, and at a given signal, each warrior made a swift movement around his particular tree. The sight of so many dark bodies glancing before their eyes at the same instant drew a hasty and consequently an ineffectual fire from the Hurons. Without stopping to breathe, the Delawares leaped in long bounds toward the wood, like so many panthers springing upon their prey. Hawkeye was in front, brandishing the terrible rifle, and animating his followers by his examples. A few of the older and more cunning Hurons, who had not been deceived by the artifice which had been practiced to draw their fire, now made a close and deadly discharge of their pieces, and justified the apprehensions of the scout by felling 3 of his foremost warriors. But the shock was insufficient to repel the impetus of the charge. The Delawares broke into the cover with the ferocity of their natures and swept away every trace of resistance by the fury of the onset. The combat endured only for an instant, hand to hand, and then the assailed yielded ground rapidly until they reached the opposite margin of the thicket, where they clung to the cover with the sort of obstinacy that is so often witnessed in hunted brutes. At this critical moment, when the success of this struggle was again becoming doubtful, the crack of a rifle was heard behind the Hurons, and a bullet came whizzing from among some beaver lodges which were situated in the clearing in the rear, and was followed by the fierce and appalling yell of a war-whoop.
"There speaks the Sagamore," shouted Hawkeye, answering the cry with his own stentorian voice. "We have them now in face and back."
The effect on the Hurons was instantaneous. Discouraged by an assault from a quarter that left them no opportunity for cover, the warriors uttered a common yell of disappointment, and breaking off in a body, they spread themselves across the opening, heedless of every consideration but flight. Many fell, in making the experiment, under the bullets and blows of the pursuing Delawares. We should not pause to detail the meeting between the scout and Chingachgook, or the more touching interview that Duncan held with Monroe. A few brief and hurried words served to explain the state of things to both parties, and then Hawkeye, pointing out the Sagamore to his band, resigned the chief authority into the hands of the Mohican chief. Chingachgook assumed the station to which his birth and experience gave him so distinguished a claim, with the grave dignity that always gives force to the mandates of a native warrior. Following the footsteps of the scout, he led the party back through the thicket, his men scalping the fallen Hurons and secreting the bodies of their own dead as they proceeded, until they gained a point where the former was content to make a halt. The warriors, who had breathed themselves freely in the preceding struggle, were now posted on a bit of level ground, sprinkled with trees in sufficient numbers to conceal them. The land fell away rather precipitously in front, and beneath his eyes stretched for several miles a narrow, dark, and wooded vale. It was through this dense and dark forest that Uncas was still contending with the main body of the Hurons. The Mohican and his friends advanced to the brow of the hill and listened with practiced ears to the sound of the combat. A few birds hovered over the leafy bosom of the valley, frightened from their secluded rests, and here and there a light vapory cloud, which seemed already blending with the atmosphere, arose above the trees and indicated some spot where the struggle had been fierce and stationary. "The fight is coming up the ascent," said Duncan, pointing in the direction of a new explosion of firearms. "We are too much in the center of their line to be effective."
"They will incline into the hollow, where the cover is thicker," said the scout, "and that will leave us well on their flank. Go, Sagamore. They will hardly be in time to give the whoop and lead on the young man. I will fight the scrimmage with warriors on my own color. You know me, Mohican. Not a Huron of them shall cross the swell into your rear without the notice of Killdeer."
The Indian chief paused another moment to consider the signs of the contest, which was now rolling rapidly up the ascent, a certain evidence that the Delawares triumphed, nor did he actually quit the place until admonished of the proximity of his friends, as well as enemies, by the bullets of the former, which began to patter among the dried leaves on the ground like bits of falling hail which precede the bursting of the tempest. Hawkeye and his 3 companions withdrew a few paces to a shelter, and awaited the issue with calmness that nothing but great practice could impart in such a scene. It was not long before the reports of the rifles began to lose the echoes of the woods, and to sound like weapons discharged in the open air. Then a warrior appeared, here and there, driven to the skirts of the forest, and rallying as he entered the clearing, as at the place where the final stand was to be made. Those were soon joined by others, until a long line of swarthy figures was to be seen clinging to the cover with the obstinacy of desperation.
Hayward began to grow impatient and turned his eyes anxiously in the direction of Chingachgook. The chief was seated on a rock with nothing visible but his calm visage, considering the spectacle with an eye as deliberate as if he were posted there merely to view the struggle.
"The time has come for the Delaware to strike," said Duncan.
"Not so, not so," returned the scout. "When he scents his friends, he will let them know that he is here. See, the knaves are getting in that clump of pines, like bees settling after their flight. By the Lord, a squaw might put a bullet into the center of such a knot of dark-skins."
At that instant the whoop was given, and a dozen Hurons fell by a discharge from Chingachgook and his band. The shout that followed was answered by a single war cry from the forest, and a yell passed through the air that sounded as if 1,000 throats were united in a common effort. The Hurons staggered, deserting the center of their line, and Uncas issued from the forest through the opening they left at the head of 100 warriors. Waving his hands right and left, the young chief pointed out the enemy to his followers, who separated in pursuit. The war now divided both wings of the broken Hurons, seeking protection in the woods again, hotly pressed by the victorious warriors of the Lenape. A minute might have passed, but the sounds were already receding in different directions and gradually losing their distinctness beneath the echoing arches of the woods. One little knot of Hurons, however, had disdained to seek cover, and were retiring like lions at bay, slowly and sullenly up the acclivity where Chingachgook and his band had just deserted, to mingle more closely in the fray. Magua was conspicuous in this party, both by his fierce and savage mien, and by the air of haughty authority he yet maintained. In his eagerness to expedite the pursuit, Uncas had left himself nearly alone, but the moment his eye caught the figure of Le Subtil, every other consideration was forgotten. Raising his cry of battle, he recalled some 6 or 7 warriors, and reckless of the disparity of their numbers, he rushed upon his enemy. Le Renard, who watched the movement, paused to receive him with secret joy, but at that moment, when he thought the rashness of his impetuous young assailant had left him at his mercy, another shout was given, and La Longue Carabine was seen rushing to the rescue, attended by all his white associates. The Huron instantly turned and commenced a rapid retreat up the ascent. There was no time for greetings or congratulations, for Uncas, though unconscious of the presence of his friends, continued the pursuit with the velocity of the wind. In vain Hawkeye called him to respect the covers. The young Mohican braved the dangerous fire of his enemies, and soon compelled them to a flight as swift as his own headlong speed. It was fortunate that the race was of a short continuance, and that the white men were much favored by their position, or the Delaware would have soon outstripped all his companions, and fallen a victim to his own temerity. But ere such a calamity could happen, the pursuers, and pursued, entered the Wyandot village within striking distance of each other. Excited by the presence of their dwellings, and tired of the chase, the Hurons now made a stand, and fought around their council lodge with the fury of despair. The onset and the issue were like the passage and destruction of a whirlwind. The tomahawk of Uncas, the blows of Hawkeye, and even the still nervous arm of Monroe were all busy for that passing moment, and the ground was quickly strewed with their enemies. Still Magua, though daring and much exposed, escaped from every effort to take his life with that sort of fabled protection that was made to overlook the fortunes of favored heroes in the legends of ancient poetry. Raising a yell that spoke volumes of anger and disappointment, the subtle chief, when he saw his comrades fallen, darted away from the place, attended by his 2 only surviving friends, leaving the Delawares engaged in stripping the dead of the bloody trophies of their victory. But Uncas, who had vainly sought him in the melee, bounded forward in pursuit, Hawkeye, Hayward, and David still pressing on his footsteps. The utmost that the scout could effect was to keep the muzzle of his rifle a little in advance of his friend, to whom, however, it answered every purpose of a charmed shield. Once Magua appeared disposed to make another and a final effort to revenge his losses, but, abandoning his intention as soon as demonstrated, he leaped into a thicket of bushes, through which he was followed by his enemies, and suddenly entered the mouth of a cave already known to the reader. Hawkeye, who had only forebone to fire in tenderness to Uncas,
raised a shout of success and proclaimed aloud that now they were certain of their game. The pursuers dashed into the long and narrow entrance in time to glimpse of the retreating forms of the Hurons. Their passage through the natural galleries and subterraneous apartments of the cavern was preceded by the shrieks and cries of hundreds of women and children. The place, seen by its dim and uncertain light, appeared like the shades of the infernal regions across which unhappy ghosts and savage demons were flitting in multitudes. Still, Uncas kept his eye on Magua, as if life to him possessed but a single object. Hayward and the scout still pressed on his rear, actuated, though possibly in a less degree, by a common feeling. But their way was becoming intricate in those dark and gloomy passages, and the glimpses of the retiring warriors less distinct and frequent, and for a moment the trace was believed to be lost, when a white robe was seen fluttering in the further extremity of a passage that seemed to lead up the mountain. "'Tis Cora!" exclaimed Hayward, in a voice in which horror and delight were wildly mingled.
"Cora! Cora!"
echoed Uncas, bounding forward like a deer.
"'Tis the maiden!" shouted the scout. "Courage, lady! We come! We come!"
The chase was renewed with a diligence rendered tenfold encouraging by this glimpse of the captive. But the way was rugged, broken, and in some spots nearly impassable. Uncas abandoned his rifle and leaped forward with headlong precipitation. Hayward rashly imitated his example, though both were, a moment afterward, admonished of his madness by hearing the bellowing of a piece that the Hurons found time to discharge down the passage in the rocks, the bullet from which even gave the young Mohican a slight wound.
"We must close," said
the scout, passing his friends by a desperate leap.
"The knaves will pick us off at this distance, and see, they hold the maiden so as to shield themselves."
Though his words were unheeded, or rather unheard, his example was followed by his companions, who, by incredible exertions, got near enough to the fugitives to perceive that Cora was borne along between the two warriors, while Magua prescribed the direction and manner of their flight. At this moment the forms of all four were strongly drawn against an opening in the sky, and they disappeared. Nearly frantic with disappointment, Uncas and Hayward increased efforts that already seemed superhuman, and they issued from the cavern on the side of the mountain in time to note the route of the pursued. The course lay upon descent, and still continued hazardous and laborious. Encumbered by his rifle, and perhaps not sustained by so deep an interest in the captive as his companions, the scout suffered the latter to precede him a little, Uncas, in his turn, taking the lead of Hayward. In this manner, rocks, precipices, and difficulties were surmounted in an incredibly short space, that at another time, and under other circumstances, would have been deemed almost insuperable. But the impetuous young men were rewarded by finding that, encumbered by Cora, the Hurons were losing ground in the race.
"Stay, dog of the Wyandots!"
exclaimed Uncas, shaking his bright tomahawk at Magua.
"A Delaware girl calls stay."
"I will go no further," cried Cora, stopping unexpectedly on a ledge of rock that overhung a deep precipice at no great distance from the summit of the mountain. "Kill me if thou wilt, detestable Huron. I will go no further." The support of the maiden raised their ready tomahawks with the impious joy that fiends are thought to take in mischief, but Magua stayed the uplifted arms. The Huron chief, after casting the weapons he had wrested from his companions over the rock, drew his knife and turned to his captive with a look in which conflicting passions fiercely contended.
"Woman," he said, "choose the wigwam or the knife of Les Subtil."
Cora regarded him not, but dropping on her knees, she raised her eyes and stretched her arms towards heaven, saying in a meek and yet confiding voice, "I am thine. Do with me as thou seest best."
"Woman,"
repeated Magua, hoarsely, and endeavoring in vain to catch a glance from her serene and beaming eye,
"choose."
But Cora neither heard nor heeded his demand. The form of the Huron trembled in every fiber, and he raised his arm on high, but dropped it again with a bewildered air, like one who doubted. Once more he struggled with himself and lifted the keen weapon again, but just then a piercing cry was heard above them, and Uncas appeared. Leaping frantically from a fearful height upon the ledge, Magua recoiled a step, and one of his assistants, profiting by the chance, sheathed his own knife in the bosom of Cora. The Huron sprang like a tiger on his offending and already retreating countrymen, but the failing form of Uncas separated the unnatural combatants. Diverted from his object by this interruption and maddened by the murder he had just witnessed, Magua buried his weapon in the back of the prostrate Delaware, uttering an unearthly shout as he committed the dastardly deed. But Uncas arose from the blow as the wounded panther turns upon his foe and struck the murderer of Cora to his feet by an effort in which the last of his failing strength was expended. Then, with a stern and steady look, he turned to Le Subtil and indicated by the expression of his eye all that he would do had not the power deserted him. The latter seized the nerveless arm of the unresisting Delaware and passed his knife into his bosom 3 times, before his victim, still keeping his gaze riveted on his enemy, with a look of inextinguishable scorn, fell dead at his feet.
"Mercy! Mercy, Huron!" cried Hayward from above, in tones nearly choked with horror. "Give mercy, and thou shalt receive from it."
Whirling a bloody knife up at the imploring youth, the victorious Magua uttered a cry so fierce, so wild, and yet so joyous, that it conveyed the sounds of savage triumph to the ears of those who fought in the valley 1,000 feet below. He was answered by a burst from the lips of the scout, whose tall person was just then seen moving swiftly toward him along those dangerous crags, with steps as bold and reckless as if he possessed the power to move in air. But when the hunter reached the scene of the ruthless massacre, the ledge was tenanted only by the dead. His keen eye took a single look at the victims and then shot its glances over the difficulties of the ascent in his front. A form stood at the brow of the mountain on the very edge of the giddy height, with uplifted arms in an awful attitude of menace. Without stopping to consider his person, the rifle of Hawkeye was raised, but a rock, which fell on the head of one of the fugitives below, exposed the indignant and glowing countenance of the honest Gamut. Then Magua issued from a crevice, and, stepping with calm indifference over the body of his last associates, he leaped a wide fissure and ascended the rocks at a point where the arm of David could not reach him. A single bound would carry him to the brow of the precipice and assure his safety. Before taking the leap, however, the Huron paused, and shaking his hand at the scout, he shouted,
"The pale-faces are dogs, the Delawares women. Magua leaves them on the rocks for the crows."
Laughing hoarsely, he made a desperate leap and fell short of his mark, though his hands grasped a shrub on the verge of the height. The form of Hawkeye had crouched like a beast about to take its spring, and his frame trembled so violently with eagerness that the muzzle of the half-raised rifle played like a leaf fluttering in the wind. Without exhausting himself with fruitless efforts, the cunning Magua suffered his body to drop the length of his arms and found a fragment for his feet to rest on. Then, summoning all his powers, he renewed the attempt, and so far succeeded as to draw his knees on the edge of the mountain. It was now, when the body of his enemy was most collected together, that the agitated weapon of the scout was drawn to his shoulder. The surrounding rocks themselves were not steadier than the piece became, for the single instant that it poured out its contents. The arms of the Huron relaxed, and his body fell back a little, while his knees still kept their position. Turning a relentless look on his enemy, he shook a hand in grim defiance, but his hold loosened, and his dark person was seen cutting the air with its head downward for a fleeting instant, until it glided past the fringe of shrubbery which clung to the mountain in its rapid flight to destruction. Chapter 33. They fought, like brave men, long and well. They piled that ground with Moslem slain. They conquered, but Bazaris fell, bleeding at every vein. His few surviving comrades saw his smile when rang their loud hurrah, and the red field was won. Then saw in death his eyelids close, calmly as to a night's repose, like flowers at set of sun. Halleck. The sun found the Lenape, on the succeeding day, a nation of mourners. The sounds of their battle were over, and they had fed fat their ancient grudge and avenged their recent quarrel with the Mingwe by the destruction of a whole community. The black and murky atmosphere that floated around the spot where the Hurons had encamped sufficiently announced of itself the fate of that wandering tribe, while hundreds of ravens that struggled above the summits of the mountains or swept in noisy flocks across the wide ranges of the woods furnished a frightful direction to the scene of the combat. In short, any eye at all practiced in the signs of frontier warfare might easily have traced all of these unerring evidences of the ruthless results which attend an Indian vengeance. Still, the sun rose on the Lenape, a nation of mourners. No shouts of success, no songs of triumph were heard, and rejoicings for their victory. The latest straggler had returned from his fell employment, only to strip himself of the terrific emblems of his bloody calling and to join in the lamentations of his countrymen as a stricken people. Pride and exultation were supplanted by humility, and the fiercest of human passions was already succeeded by the most profound and unequivocal demonstrations of grief. The lodges were deserted, but a broad belt of earnest faces encircled a spot in their vicinity, whither everything possessing life had repaired, and where all were now collected in deep and awful silence. Though beings of every rank and age, of both sexes, and of all pursuits had united to form this breathing wall of bodies, they were influenced by a single emotion. Each eye was riveted on the center of that ring, which contained the objects of so much and so common an interest. 6 Delaware girls with their long, dark, flowing tresses falling loosely across their bosoms stood apart, and only gave proof of their existence as they occasionally strewed sweet, scented herbs and forest flowers on a litter of fragrant plants that, under a pall of Indian robes, supported all that now remained of the ardent, high-souled, and generous Cora. Her form was concealed in many wrappers of the same simple manufacture, and her face was shut forever from the gaze of men. At her feet was seated the desolate Monroe. His aged head was bowed nearly to the earth in compelled submission to that stroke of Providence, but a hidden anguish struggled around his furrowed brow that was only partially concealed by his careless locks of gray that had fallen, neglected, on his temples. Gamut stood at his side, his meek head bared to the rays of the sun, while his eyes, wondering and concerned, seemed to be equally divided between that little volume, which contained so many quaint but holy maxims, and the being in whose behalf his soul yearned to administer consolation. Hayward was also nigh, supporting himself against a tree and endeavoring to keep down those sudden risings of sorrow that it required his utmost manhood to subdue. But sad and melancholy as this group may easily be imagined, it was far less touching than another that occupied the opposite space of the same area. Seated, as in life, with his form and limbs arranged in grave and decent composure, Uncas appeared, arrayed in the most gorgeous ornaments that the wealth of the old tribe could furnish. Rich plumes nodded above his head, wampum, gorgets, bracelets, and medals adorned his person in profusion, though his dull eye and vacant lineaments too strongly contradicted the idle tale of pride they would convey. Directly in front of the corpse, Chingachgook was placed. Without arms, paint, or adornment of any sort, except the bright blue blazonry of his race that was indelibly impressed on his naked bosom. During the long period that the tribe had thus been collected, the Mohican warrior had kept a steady, anxious look on the cold and senseless countenance of his son. So riveted and intense had been that gaze, and so changeless his attitude, that a stranger might not have told the living from the dead, but for the occasional gleamings of a troubled spirit that shot athwart the dark visage of one, and the death-like calm that had forever settled on the lineaments of the other. The scout was hard by, leaning in a pensive posture on his own fatal and avenging weapon, while Tamenund, supported by the elders of his nation, occupied a high place at hand whence he might look down on the mute and sorrowful assemblage of his people. Just within the inner edge of the circle stood a soldier in the military attire of a strange nation, and without it was his war horse, in the center of a collection of mounted domestics, seemingly in readiness to undertake some distant journey. The vestments of the stranger announced him to be one who held a responsible situation near the person of the captain of the Canadas, who was, as it would now seem, finding his errand of peace frustrated by the fierce impetuosity of his allies, was contented to become a silent and sad spectator of the fruits of a contest that he had arrived too late to anticipate. The day was drawing to a close of its first quarter, and yet had the multitude maintained in its breathing stillness since its dawn. No sound louder than a stifled sob had been heard among them, nor had even a limb been moved throughout that long and painful period, except to perform the simple and touching offerings that were made, from time to time, in commemoration of the dead. The patience and forbearance of Indian fortitude could alone support such an appearance of abstraction, as seemed now to have turned each dark and motionless figure into stone. At length the sage of the Delaware stretched forth an arm, and, leaning on the shoulders of his attendants, he arose with an air as feeble as if another age had already intervened between the man who met the nation the preceding day and him who now tottered on his elevated stand.
"Men of the Lenape,"
he said, in low, hollow tones that sounded like a voice charged with some prophetic mission,
"the face of the Manitou is behind a cloud. His eye is turned from you. His ears are shut. His tongue gives you no answer. You see him not, yet his judgments are before you. Let your hearts be open and your spirits tell no lie. Men of the Lenape, the face of the Manitou is behind a cloud."
As this simple and yet terrible enunciation stole on the ears of the multitude, a stillness as deep and awful succeeded as if the venerated spirit they worshipped had uttered the words without the aid of human organs, and even the inanimate Uncas appeared a being of life compared with the humbled and submissive throng by whom he was surrounded. As the immediate effect, however, gradually passed away, a low murmur of voices commenced a sort of chant in honor of the dead. The sounds were those of females and were thrillingly soft and wailing. The words were connected by no regular continuation, but as one ceased another took up the eulogy or lamentation, whichever it might be called, and gave vent to her emotions in such language as was suggested by her feelings and the occasion. At intervals the speaker was interrupted by general and loud bursts of sorrow, during which the girls around the bier of Cora plucked the plants and flowers blindly from her body as if bewildered with grief. But, in the milder moments of their plaint, these emblems of purity and sweetness were cast back to their places with every sign of tenderness and regret. Though rendered less connected by many and general interruptions and outbreakings, a translation of their language would have contained a regular descant which, in substance, might have proved to possess a train of consecutive ideas. A girl, selected for the task by her rank and qualifications, commenced by modest allusions to the qualities of the deceased warrior, embellishing her expressions with those oriental images that the Indians have probably brought with them from the extremes of the other continent, and which form of themselves a link to connect the ancient history of the two worlds. She called him the panther of his tribe, and described him as one whose moccasin left no trail on the dews, whose bound was like the leap of a young fawn, whose eye was brighter than a star in the dark night, and whose voice in battle was loud as the thunder of the Manitou. She reminded him of the mother who bore him, and dwelt forcibly on the happiness she must feel in possessing such a son. She bade him tell her, when they met in the world of spirits, that the Delaware girls had shed tears above the grave of her child, and had called her blessed. They who succeeded, changing their tones to a milder and still more tender strain, alluded, with the delicacy and sensitiveness of women, to a stranger maiden who had left the upper earth at the time so near his own departure as to render the will of the Great Spirit too manifest to be disregarded. They admonished him to be kind to her, and to have consideration for her ignorance of those arts which were so necessary to the comfort of a warrior like himself. They dwelled upon her matchless beauty and on her noble resolution, without the taint of envy, and, as angels may be thought, to delight in a superior excellence, adding that these endowments should prove more equivalent for any little imperfection of her education. After which others again in due succession spoke to the maiden herself, in the low, soft language of tenderness and love. They exhorted her to be of cheerful mind, and to fear nothing for her future welfare. A hunter would be her companion, who knew how to provide for her smallest wants, and a warrior was at her side, who was able to protect her against every danger. They promised that her path should be pleasant, and her burden light. They cautioned her against unavailing regrets for the friends of her youth, and the scenes where her father had dwelt, and assuring her that the blessed hunting grounds of the Lenape contained vales as pleasant, streams as pure, and flowers as sweet as the heaven of the palefaces. They advised her to be attentive to the wants of her companion, and never to forget the distinction with which the Manitou had so wisely established between them. Then, in a wild burst of their chant, they sang with united voices the temper of the Mohican's mind. They pronounced him noble, manly, and generous, all that became a warrior and all that a maid might love. Clothing their ideas in the most remote and subtle images, they betrayed that, in the short period of their intercourse, they had discovered, with the intuitive perception of their sex, the truant dispositions of his inclinations. The Delaware girls had found no favor in his eyes. He was of a race that had once been lords on the shore of the Salt Lake, and his wishes had led him back to a people who dwelt above the graves of his fathers. Why should not such a predilection be encouraged? That she was of a blood purer and richer than the rest of her nation, any eye might have seen. That she was equal to the dangers and daring of a life in the woods, her conduct had proved. And now, they added, the wise one of the earth had transplanted her to a place where she would find congenial spirits and might be forever happy. Then, with another transition in voice and subject, allusions were made to the virgin who wept in the adjacent lodge. They compared her to flakes of snow, as pure, as white, as brilliant, and as liable to melt in the fierce heats of summer or congeal in the frost of winter. They doubted not that she was lovely in the eyes of the young chief, whose skin and whose sorrow seemed so like her own. But though far from expressing such a preference, it was evident they deemed her less excellent than the maid they mourned. Still, they denied her no need her rare charms might properly claim. Her ringlets were compared to the exuberant tendrils of the vine, her eye to the blue vault of heavens, and the most spotless cloud, with its glowing flush of the sun, was admitted to be less attractive than her bloom. During these and similar songs, nothing was audible but the murmurs of the music, relieved as it was, or rather rendered terrible, by those occasional bursts of grief which might be called its choruses. The Delawares themselves listened like charmed men, and it was very apparent, by the variations of their speaking countenance, how deep and true was their sympathy. Even David was not reluctant to lend his ears to the tones of voices so sweet, and long ere the chant was ended, his gaze announced that his soul was enthralled. The scout, to whom alone of all the white men the words were intelligible, suffered himself to be a little aroused from his meditative posture and bent his face aside to catch their meaning as the girls proceeded. But when they spoke of the future prospects of Cora and Uncas, he shook his head, like one who knew the error of their simple creed, and resuming his reclining attitude, he maintained it until the ceremony, if that might be called a ceremony, in which feeling was so deeply imbued, was finished. Happily for the self-command of both Hayward and Monroe, they knew not the meaning of the wild sounds they heard. Chingachgook was a solitary exception to the interest manifested by the native part of the audience. His look never changed throughout the whole of the scene, nor did a muscle move in his rigid countenance, even at the wildest or the most pathetic parts of the lamentation. The cold and senseless remains of his son was all to him, and every other sense was that of sight seemed frozen, in order that his eyes might take their final gaze at those lineaments he had so long loved, and which were now about to be closed forever from his view. In this stage of the obsequies, a warrior much renowned for deed in arms, and more especially for services in the recent combat, a man of stern and grave demeanor, advanced slowly from the crowd and placed himself nigh the person of the dead.
"Why hast thou left us, pride of the Wapanaki?" he said, addressing himself to the dull ears of Uncas as if the empty clay were trained the faculties of the animated man. "Thy time has been like that of the sun when in the trees, thy glory brighter than his light at noonday. Thou art gone, youthful warrior, but 100 Wyandots are clearing the biers from thy path to the world of the spirits. Who that saw thee in battle would believe that thou couldst die? Who before thee has ever shown Ottawa the way into the fight? Thy feet were like the wings of eagles, thine arm heavier than falling branches from the pine, and thy voice like the Manitow which he speaks in the clouds. The tongue of Ottawa is weak," he added, looking about him with a melancholy gaze, "and his heart is exceeding heavy. Pride of the Wapanaki, why hast thou left us?" He was succeeded by others in due order until most of the high and gifted men of the nation had sung or spoken their tribute of praise over the manes of the deceased chief. When each had ended, another deep and breathing silence reigned in all the place. Then a low, deep sound was heard, like the suppressed accompaniment of distant music, rising just high enough on the air to be audible, and yet so indistinctly as to leave its character and the place whence it proceeded alike matters of conjecture. It was, however, succeeded by another and another strain, each in a higher key, until they grew on the ear, first in long-drawn and often repeated interjections, and finally in words. The lips of Chingachgook had so far parted as to announce that it was the monody of the father. Though not an eye was turned toward him, nor the smallest sign of impatience exhibited, it was apparent by the manner in which the multitude elevated their heads to listen that they drank in the sounds with an intentness of attention that none but Tamenund himself had ever before commanded. But they listened in vain. The strains rose just so loud as to become intelligible, and then grew fainter and more trembling, until they finally sank on the ear, as if borne away by a passing breath of wind. The lips of the Sagamore closed, and he remained silent in his seat, looking with his riveted eye and motionless form, like some creature that had turned from the almighty hand with the form, but without the spirit of a man. The Delawares, who knew by these symptoms that the mind of their friend was not prepared for so mighty an effort of fortitude, relaxed in their attention, and with an innate delicacy seemed to bestow all their thought on the obsequies of the stranger maiden. A signal was given by one of the elder chiefs to the women who crowded the part of the circle near which the body of Cora lay,
Obedient to the sign, the girls raised the bier to the elevation of their heads and advanced with slow and regulated steps, chanting, as they proceeded, another wailing song in praise of the deceased. Gamut, who had been a close observer of rites he seemed to heathenish, now bent his head over the shoulder of the unconscious father, whispering, "I move with the remains of thy child. Shall we not follow and see them interred with Christian burial?" Monroe started, as if the last trumpet had sounded in his ear, and bestowing one anxious and hurried glance around him, he rose and followed in one simple train, with the mien of a soldier but bearing the full burden of a parent's suffering. His friends pressed around him with the sorrow that was too strong to be termed sympathy. Even the young Frenchman joined in the procession with the air of a man who was sensibly touched at the early and melancholy fate of one so lovely. But when the last and humblest female of the tribe had joined in the wild and yet ordered array, the men of the Lenape contracted their circle and formed again around the person of Uncas, as silent, as grave, and as motionless as before. The place which had been chosen for the grave of Cora was a little knoll, where a cluster of young and healthful pines had taken root, forming of themselves a melancholy and appropriate shade over the spot. On reaching it, the girls deposited their burden and continued for many minutes waiting, with characteristic patience and native timidity, for some evidence that they whose feelings were most concerned were content with the arrangement. At length the scout, who alone understood their habits, said, in their own language, "My daughters have done well. The white men thank them." Satisfied that this testimony in their favor, the girls proceeded to deposit the body in a shell, ingeniously and not inelegantly fabricated of the bark of the birch, after which they lowered it into its dark and final abode. The ceremony of covering the remains and concealing the marks of the fresh earth by leaves and other natural and customary objects was conducted with the same simple and silent forms. But when the labors of the kind beings who had performed these sad and friendly offices were so far completed, they hesitated, in a way to show that they knew not how much further they might proceed. It was in this stage of the rites that the scout again addressed them. "My young women have done enough," he said. "The spirit of the paleface has no need of food or raiment, their gifts being according to the heaven of their color. I see," he added, glancing an eye at David, who was preparing his book in a manner that indicated an intention to lead the way in sacred song, "that one who better knows the Christian fashions is about to speak." The females stood modestly aside, and from having been the principal actors in the scene, they now became the meek and attentive observers of that which followed. During the time David occupied in pouring out the pious feelings of the spirit in this manner, not a sign of surprise nor a look of impatience escaped them. They listened like those who knew the meaning of the strange words, and appeared as if they felt the mingled emotions of sorrow, hope, resignation they were intended to convey. Excited by the scene he had just witnessed, and perhaps influenced by his own secret emotions, the master of song exceeded his usual efforts. His full, rich voice was not found to suffer by a comparison with the soft tones of the girls, and his more modulated strains possessed, at least for the ears of those to whom they were peculiarly addressed, the additional power of intelligence. He ended the anthem as he had commenced it, in the midst of a grave and solemn stillness. When, however, the closing cadence had fallen on the ears of its auditors, the secret, timorous glances of the eyes and the general and yet subdued movement of the assemblage betrayed that something was expected from the father of the deceased. Monroe seemed sensible that the time was come for him to exert what is, perhaps, the greatest effort of which human nature is capable. He bared his gray locks, and looked around the timid and quiet throng by which he was encircled with a firm and collected countenance. Then, motioning with his hand for the scout to listen, he said, Say to these kind and gentle females that a heartbroken and failing man returns them his thanks. Tell them that the being we all worship under different names will be mindful of their charity, and that the time shall not be distant when we may assemble around his throne without distinction of sex or rank or color. The scout listened to his tremulous voice in which the veteran delivered these words, and shook his head slowly when they were ended, as one who doubted their efficacy.
"To tell them this," he said, "would be to tell them that the snow comes not in the winter, or that the sun shines fiercest when trees are stripped of their leaves."
Then turning to the women, he made such a communication of the other's gratitude as he deemed most suited to the capacities of his listeners. The head of Monroe had already sunk upon his chest, and he was again fast relapsing into melancholy, when the young Frenchman before named ventured to touch him lightly on the elbow. As soon as he had gained the attention of the mourning old man, he pointed towards a group of young Indians, who approached with a light but closely covered litter, and then pointed upward towards the sun. "I understand you, sir," returned Monroe, with a voice of forced firmness. "I understand you. It is the will of heaven, and I submit. Cora, my child, if the prayers of a heart-broken father could avail thee now, how blessed shouldst thou be! Come, gentlemen," he added, looking about him with an air of lofty composure, through the anguish that quivered in his faded countenance was far too powerful to be concealed. "Our duty here is ended. Let us depart." Hayward gladly obeyed a summons that took them from a spot where each instant he felt his self-control was about to desert him. While his companions were mounting, however, he found time to press the hand of the scout, and to repeat the terms of an engagement they had made to meet again within the posts of the British Army. Then, gladly throwing himself into the saddle, he spurred his charger to the side of the litter, whence low and stifled sobs alone announced the presence of Alice. In this manner, the head of Monroe again drooping on his bosom, with Hayward and David following in sorrowing silence, and attended by the aid of Montcalm with his guard, all the white men, with the exception of Hawkeye, passed from before the eyes of the Delawares, and were buried in the vast forests of that region. But the tie which, through their common calamity, had united the feelings of these simple dwellers in the woods with the strangers who had thus transiently visited them, was not so easily broken. Years passed away before the traditionary tale of the White Maiden and of the young warrior of the Mohicans ceased to beguile the long nights and tedious marches, or to animate their youthful and brave with a desire for vengeance. Neither were the secondary actors in these momentous incidents forgotten. Through the medium of the scout, who served for years afterward as a link between them and civilized life, they learned, in answer to their inquiries, that the Greyhead was speedily gathered to his fathers, borne down, as was erroneously believed, by his military misfortunes, and that the Open Hand had conveyed his surviving daughter far into the settlements of the Palefaces, where her tears had at last ceased to flow, and had been succeeded by the bright smiles which were better suited to her joyous nature. But these were events of a later time than that which concerns our tale. Deserted by all of his color, Hawkeye returned to the spot where sympathies led him, with a force that no ideal bond of union could destroy. He was just in time to catch a parting look of the features of Uncas, whom the Delawares were already enclosing in the last vestment of skins. They paused to permit the longing and lingering gaze of the sturdy woodsman, and when it was ended, the body was enveloped, never to be unclosed again. Then came a procession like the other, and the whole nation was collected about the temporary grave of the chief, temporary because it was proper that at some future day his bones should rest among those of his own people. The movement, like the feeling, had been simultaneous and general. The same grave expression of grief, the same rigid sentence, and the same deference to the principal mourner were observed around the place of interment as has already been described. The body was deposited in an attitude of repose, facing the rising sun, with the implements of war and of the chase at hand, in readiness for the final journey. An openness was left in the shell by which it was protected from the soil, for the spirit to communicate with its earthly tenement when necessary, and the whole was concealed from the instinct and protected from the ravages of the beasts of prey with an ingenuity peculiar to the natives. The manual rites then ceased, and all present reverted to the more spiritual part of the ceremonies. Chingachgook became once more the object of the common attention. He had not yet spoken, and something consolatory and instructive was expected from so renowned a chief on an occasion of such interest. Conscious of the wishes of his people, the stern and self-restrained warrior raised his face, which had latterly been buried in his robe, and looked about him with a steady eye. His firmly compressed and expressive lips then severed, and for the first time during the long ceremonies his voice was distinctly audible.
"Why do my brothers mourn?"
he said, regarding the dark race of dejected warriors by whom he was envisioned.
"Why do my daughters weep? That a young man has gone to the happy hunting grounds. That a chief has filled his time with honor. He was good. He was dutiful. He was brave. Who can deny it? The Manitao has need of such a warrior, and he has called him away. As for me, the son and the father of Uncas, I am a blazed pine in a clearing of the pale faces. My race has gone from the shores of the Salt Lake and the hills of the Delawares. But who can say that the serpent of his tribe has forgotten his wisdom? I am alone."
"No, no!" cried Hawkeye, who had been gazing with a yearning look at the rigid features of his friend with something like his own self-command, but whose philosophy could endure no longer. "No, Sagamore, not alone. The gifts of our colors may be different, but God has placed us as to journey in the same path. I have no kin, and I may also say, like you, no people. He was your son, and a redskin by nature, and it may be that your blood was nearer. But if ever I forget the lad who has so often fought at my side in war, and slept at my side in peace, may he who made us all, whatever be our color or our gifts, forget me. The boy has left us for a time, but Sagamore, you are not alone." Chingachgook grasped that hand in the warmth of feeling. The scout had stretched across the fresh earth, and in an attitude of friendship these two sturdy and intrepid woodsmen bowed their heads together, while scalding tears fell to their feet, watering the grave of Uncas like drops of falling rain. In the midst of awful stillness, with which such a burst of feeling, coming as it did from the two most renowned warriors of that region, was received, Tamenund lifted his voice to disperse the multitude.
"It is enough," he said. "Go, children of the Lenape. The anger of the Manitao is not done. Why should Tamenund stay? The pale faces are masters of the earth, and the time of the red men has not yet come again. My day has been too long. In the morning I saw the sons of Unamis happy and strong, and yet, before the night has come, have I lived to see the last warrior of the wise race of the Mohicans."
End of Last of the Mohicans.